Yeah, I'm Sarah, and today I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've been doing at Harvard to use the QDM, quantum diamond microscopy techniques for problems of planetary magnetism. Not exactly like this, but close. So if you don't know what the QDM is by now, I'm not sure this talk is going to fix it, but essentially it's a tool for making magnetic images at the surface of a sample with about 1 micron resolution over what is technically wide field, in this case about 1 by 2 millimeters. And this turns out to be a really useful parameter space for studying extraterrestrial samples. You guys have some context already. It's so nice to go last, actually, for why these samples can be so complicated. But you're often working with really small sample volumes, especially as you're looking ahead to return samples that can contain multiple generations of magnetization, some of which could predate accretion of the parent body. And also, often these form in environments that are really different from the Earth. So they can contain magnetic minerals that we just don't really know the magnetic properties of, or that are really prone to weathering or alteration in Earth's atmosphere. And then if you're working with any meteorite, it's safe to assume that it's probably shocked, which can modify samples in really confusing, heterogeneous ways. So all of these make any sort of bulk magnetometry approach very difficult and make it very useful to be able to actually resolve magnetization in your sample. And so with that said, in my experience, applications of QDM to planetary things, also really in general, tend to fall into one of two categories. So either magnetic petrography, so trying to figure out where magnetization is in a sample, what minerals carry it. This is a much more common application, I would say, and you compare it with a lot of other kinds of study. And then the alternative is what we kind of call a super 2G. So using the QDM as like a primary paleomagnetic investigation tool to basically extend these net moment magnetometry, like classic 2G experiments to really small or complicated samples. And so I'm actually going to split this talk into two and talk about like one project from each of these categories. So I'll talk fast. So first I want to talk about the magnetic mineralogy of aurites and how we've been using quantum diamond microscopy to learn about that. So aurites are a group of instantite-rich achondrites, so meteorites from differentiated bodies. And what makes them really special is that they formed under particularly reducing conditions, so about 5 to 7 log units below the iron leucite buffer. So extremely reducing. And that makes them possibly really useful as a magnetic analog for Mercury, just a way of possibly understanding what minerals carry the crustal or are producing the crustal fields we observe today on Mercury's surface, well, above Mercury's surface. And this is actually a really important question because what you assume about what minerals are producing those crustal fields completely change what you would like interpret about the ancient Permian dynamo. So just to kind of give an example, if we assume that the main magnetic carrier is multi-domain iron, just for the sake of conversation, assume that that can carry like a stable remnants over the timescales we're talking about. You can estimate this sort of TRM efficiency parameter. So how efficiently would like a parcel of crust where that is the main magnetic carrier, what magnetization would that acquire in a given field? And so that depends both on just fundamental properties of iron and also how much iron you would be able to produce with the available like iron atoms in Mercury's crust, since it's relatively iron depleted. And so if that's the main magnetic carrier, you actually require a much stronger field in the past on Mercury than what we see today. And this is like sort of what you would expect theoretically, but like about 10 times stronger. On the other hand, if you assume that pyrrhotite is the main magnetic carrier, you can accommodate much weaker paleo fields. So you could essentially have a history where Mercury's dynamo hasn't changed very much over time. And then you would have to understand how that's possible. And then of course, if you change the thickness of the layer that you assume carries that magnetization, you get even more room to play there. But the basic idea holds that you get like orders of magnitude uncertainty in the paleo field intensity on Mercury just based on what you assume is like the most important magnetic mineral. So it's really important to get this like not completely wrong. And that turns out to be really hard because they're actually, you don't need to read all this, oh my God. There are a lot of magnetic minerals that have been proposed to carry magnetization of Mercury's crust. This is in part because we just don't know a ton about these very reduced materials. They're really hard to study. And some of these you can see, like, we don't even have like Curie temperatures measured for some of these minerals. So like, how would you even study that, right? But you know, that's where we get into looking at natural samples, what is actually present in those. and to abrates. So previous to my knowledge, magnetic study of abrates is exceptionally limited. We basically just have susceptibility measurements, which are really variable since they tend to be super coarse-grained. And basically, other than that, it's just observing what minerals are present. And then we say, okay, I see iron nickel. I know that iron nickel can be magnetic. So probably that's responsible for whatever magnetism we see in the abrates. And that's for a long time been the extent of it. Only recently, earlier this year, did we get the first like rock magnetic data from an abrate. So this is from the Rivik fall, which I think fell in late 2024. It's really convenient when like the samples you need literally fall from the sky. But that being said, it's still unfortunately not super informative. You can tell that there's some like harder material in here, but like higher porosity material in here, but otherwise we don't really actually know very much more than we did before we had this data. So what we wanted to do was revisit this question. Right now, mostly focusing on the abrate Cumberland Falls. This is actually a particularly hard abrate to study with any sort of bulk approach because it has these classes of chondritic material, which are a lot more iron rich than the rest of the abrate. And so if you like, well, actually, as an example, one of the first things we did was acquire a thermomagnetic curve for a piece of Cumberland Falls. And so first we see magnetite, which, well, what does we think probably magnetite, which either tells us that we're altering the sample, which is very likely, or it could be something in the chondrites. And then some probably higher Curie temperature here, which is probably the iron nickel metal we observe, but yeah, this is very hard to interpret. So what is much nicer to interpret is this very classic like magnetic petrography approach. So using EDS to identify the minerals. This is a class of sulfides, and we look elsewhere in the sample as well, and then co-register that with magnetic imagery from the QDM. These very fancy micron-scale magnetic pictures. And so, for instance, we can look at this blue mineral and this green mineral, alabandite and daubralite, which are rare minerals, but neither of those are expected to carry any remnants of room temperature, and neither is the instant hit around it. And you can see there's not really much signal associated with those in the QDM image. But we see a lot of magnetic signal associated with schreibersite, iron nickel metal elsewhere in the sample, and then also with pyrrhotite. So we can infer that those three minerals are at least capable of carrying magnetization. And we actually we're sort of in the middle actually of a sort of pseudo Lowry test. So 2 orthogonal irons, and we can see that this is capable of carrying like an actual lab field, and you know, you can recover the direction from that. So that's encouraging. But I actually want to step back. So what's really interesting here, I kind of glazed past it, I don't know if anyone caught it, is that we see pyrrhotite in this sample. I don't know if you remember, perhaps that pyrrhotite is sort of an end member here. Like it would allow very weak fields in the past on Mercury. But more importantly, it's actually not supposed to be there at all. Typically, when you're looking at really reduced samples, and these are like really reduced, you expect it to really only occur as troilite, which should look like those kind of empty regions, like the instatite or the daubralite that I showed in the other image. So the fact that we, with EDS, recover a composition that's like consistent with monoclinic pyrrhotite, and we also see magnetic signal associated with that, is kind of unusual. And yeah, so this complicated plot kind of summarizes why we believe that troilite should not occur, or sorry, pyrrhotite should not occur. So this is a little complicated. I'm sorry, don't be afraid. But the general idea is that if you have a sulfur fugacity and a temperature, you should, in theory, be able to predict what the metal to sulfur ratio of the pyrrhotite you form is. And only a metal sulfur ratio of about 0.875, which is monoclinic pyrrhotite, should be like unambiguously magnetically important. And then you can map, like you can connect sulfur fugacity and temperature to oxygen fugacity, in this case using a pyrrhotite magnetite equilibrium equation here. And so if, for instance, this would be like the FMQ buffer on this plot, so something formed, pyrrhotite formed, at that buffer should have like 0.95 metal to sulfur ratio, right? And it's tempting to just kind of project these lines out and say, okay, well, this is like that iron wish-type -5 region where Mercury and the Albrights live. So they're on the other side of this 1-1 line that represents troilite. So there shouldn't be anything else in there. But in practice, that's actually not, like, you can't really do that. Like, this is the only way that you are able to connect that sulfur fugacity and temperature is through that equilibrium equation, which in this case, you're outside of the region where magnetite is actually forming, so that no longer applies. So there's a lot of questions here about whether this is like reasonable and how to interpret it. But essentially, it seems like there could be some way that perhaps monoclinic pyrrhotite could be stable under much more reducing conditions than we previously expected, when you're like out of the typical region that we're talking about with most like Earth and Mars rocks. There is also the possibility that like iron liberation from troilite and some kind of complicated heating perhaps reverted something that was originally troilite to a pyrrhotite composition. It's hard to say. And we have a lot of work in progress right now. This is still like ongoing work. And if you want to hear more about this, I actually have a poster immediately after this. I hope you're not tired of stuff again, but so feel free to come by. But we're in the middle of a thermal demag in controlled atmosphere of this slice, and also planning some like crystallographic characterization to try to just understand what we're seeing, and then hopefully also extend this to other albrights and some synthetic mercury analog samples. So this is just like a sort of example of that. And then to pivot, talking about, this is something that I've done a lot more during my PhD, is actually using the QDM as a primary paleomagnetic instrument. And in this case, focusing on the meteorite ALH 84001. So ALH 84001 is a Martian meteorite. It's about 4.1 billion years old. And that makes it, to my knowledge, the oldest Martian meteorite that hasn't been like remagnetized by hand magnets. So this is really valuable as a potential direct like paleomagnetic recorder of magnetic fields on Mars. But since its crystallization 4.1 billion years ago, it experienced an early metamorphic event and also some later impacts that probably heated the meteorite. So to kind of put this in the context of Mars's magnetic history more broadly, I would say the main question that we have right now about Mars's ancient dynamo, because Mars used to have a dynamo at some point in the past, and that shut down. It no longer has an active dynamo. And so the question, of course, is when did the dynamo turn off? And one of the most popular ways of kind of trying to answer that question is looking at these large impact basins on Mars, which look like totally magnetic at high altitudes. And so naturally you would say, okay, well, probably the dynamo turned off before those basins formed and heated everything. So that gives you a dynamo sensation before about 4.1 billion years ago. But more recently, there have been some studies that identified like younger volcanic constructs that seem to actually be strongly magnetized. And so this is like the alternative hypothesis of a later dynamicization, just, you know, late being like 3.9 GA, but. And so if we like add onto this plot the different impacts or heating events in the history of ALH 84001, it ends up being very perfectly positioned to distinguish between these hypotheses. Like we can look directly for evidence of an active dynamo field on Mars, which is very convenient. So it has been sort of extensively studied, just to summarize kind of the main takeaways. First of all, there are two major magnetic populations in ALH 84001. There are these primary chromite pyrrhotite assemblages, which could in theory carry magnetization as old as the meteorite, but are also kind of historically understudied just because they tend to be very close to other things and hard to magnetically distinguish. And then there are the very famous carbonate blebs, which were allegedly produced by magnetotactic bacteria. It was like a whole like panspermia thing some years ago, but probably they're actually produced by siderite decomposition. And please nobody tell Joe Kirschman that I said that. But we also know that the interior of ALH 84001 probably hasn't been heated substantially since it left Mars. And it has this really bizarre pattern of strong but heterogeneous magnetization, which I'm sure you all can understand why you should not expect that to see in the interior of a rock. And there was one study that actually reported these two antipodal components in different coercivity ranges. So it's completely bizarre. You kind of have all the problems. You have magnetic populations of different ages, just a really difficult, complicated, spatially heterogeneous magnetization. So this is kind of a perfect thing to approach with the quantum diamond microscope. And our particular goal here was to characterize the inner rim in the chromite sulfide assemblages, since these are the oldest magnetic materials in the rock. So just to really, let's just sit in this for a second. So this is an image of a slice of ALH8400 with a squid microscope, just to kind of give a sense of what previously we would have been able to resolve. So you can see, yes, this strong heterogeneous magnetization. And then the same region with the QDM. So this is like, thankfully, actually enough to resolve individual sources. And in this case, I mean, we're not talking about like individual dipole sources, but these are like assemblages of grains that probably have like a particular shared magnetic heating history, right? So this is very cool. And then to quantify it, the actual magnetization of those individual sources, we go through this three-step process of picking out the source that we're interested in, upward continuation, which is sort of like a spectral approach to simulating imaging at a slightly higher liftoff, so you can average out that like fine structure, and then fit the resulting map to a dipole to recover a unique direction and moment. And that lets us do all of those classic experiments we would like to do if we have like cores. So we can do, for instance, AF demagnetization or a thermal demagnetization. So like heating the slice and then imaging it between each heating step, and then fit magnetic components from that data. You can also do kind of arbitrarily complex experiments this way. So we did anisotropy correction for each individual source to correct for that. We also did PTRM acquisition experiments and ARM demag to estimate paleointensities, and then naturally a big contact test with the fusion crust. So I'm like speeding through that, but at the end of the day, what we ended up with were 12 robust magnetic components that fall into these two distinct clusters, neither of which seems to overlap very much with the fusion cluster actually. And each of these clusters are like individually and jointly statistically significant. They also have distinct but strong paleointensities, so much stronger than what we would expect for modern crustal fields most places on Mars today. What we also found is actually a third magnetic population of chromite sulfide assemblages, and also in this case, these are carbonates here that seem to be very weakly magnetized today, but are capable of acquiring ARMs, even in a relatively weak bias field. So I think this was about less than 5 or 10 microtesla magnetizing field, like in whatever original TRM they acquired. So this third weakly magnetic population. So just within one like family of sources, so chromite sulfide assemblages, we have these 3 distinct magnetic populations, which if you're reasonable at this point, you're probably asking how that could be possible. Unfortunately, Adrian's group actually was able to do these mesoscale impact simulations into like simulated regions of ALH8400. So you might recognize some of these sources that we like labeled from previous slides. And what you actually observe is that the heating from even kind of large impacts is very heterogeneous within the sample at like sub-millimeter scales. And chromites in particular, which are the black sources here, stay very cold. Even at impacts up to like 30 GPa, they don't like surpass the Curie temperature of pyrrhotite in the interior, like after everything equilibrates. So unless a chromite happens to be very close to like a carbonate field or a shear heating zone, it's entirely possible that it could just not be significantly heated, even in a relatively large impact. And so you would actually expect that within a single sample, you could have magnetizations of just completely different ages, or just within a single like, you know, chromite sulfide assemblage population. And so in this case, we would say that probably these 3 different populations we identify record different impact events. And so this gives us like 2 main ways that we can interpret the remnants that we see. So, and remember those 2 clusters are separated by a very large angle, so about 140 degrees. So one possibility is that between that initial heating event And the second impact, the dynamo reverse polarity. This has been proposed based on like paleopole inversions on Mars, which of course are like notoriously tricky, but not entirely implausible. And in that case, this would represent like a direct reversal record in a meteorite, which would be like extremely cool. The other option, which is way less cool, is that the rock just rotated 140 degrees between impact events. Of course, this is something that's like harder to do on a planet without like a robust plate tectonic system, but we can't rule it out. And then after this magnetization was imparted, there's a late impact at about 1.3 GA that would have occurred after the dynamo shut down. And so then that weakly magnetized population would just represent the surrounding crustal fields. So if we put this back on that original timeline, we see that this gives us pretty strong evidence that the dynamo on Mars was active at about 4 and about 3.9 GA. And so that means that this kind of long-standing hypothesis of an early dynamo cessation on Mars can't be correct necessarily. And there's been like a movement in the last couple of years towards this later cessation. We've also been doing a lot of work to understand how you could produce basins that look weakly magnetic at altitude if the dynamo is still active. And actually, if you assume that the kind of reversal hypothesis is correct, like that these clusters actually represent a record of reversing Martian dynamo, it turns out that you might actually expect large basins because they cool so slowly and can acquire magnetization in these near antipodal directions. You might actually expect them to appear weakly magnetic anyway. So this is still sort of an active mystery, but this is a really kind of powerful constraint. I would say, thinking about like future directions, of course, there's been a lot of interesting stuff about magnetic microscopy in this session. But in my experience, I felt like ALH 84001 was sort of a perfect sample for QDM. And what would be really cool is if we could extend these approaches to samples that are like not as good. So for instance, like all those fields of view, that large sulfide or whatever in Cumberland Falls, like we don't really have good ways to quantify magnetization in those complicated things. And also stuff where you have very complicated backgrounds. So but there's been a lot of work in this space, and I think it'll be really cool to see how the field develops to be able to learn about really different samples. So, yeah. Oh, and then I also want to pitch, if you do, well, first of all, the IRM allegedly has a QDM available for use, and you should come use it. And if you do, you should archive your data in Magic, because it was a real pain to figure out how to archive QDM data. But it won't be a pain for you. It'll be fun. And so you should do it.